Today we will be talking about condominium bylaws. By watching this video, you'll be on your way to achieving and maintaining social and financial success in your condo. Let's start with the basics of what bylaws are. Bylaws are binding documents governing how a condominium corporation should be operated. They are binding for all owners, directors, and officers of a condominium corporation. In order to be passed, bylaws require approval from both the board of directors and the owners. Different bylaws have different approval thresholds, which we'll get into later. Once a bylaw is approved, it's registered on title against all types of units in the condominium. This may include parking spaces and storage lockers. It is important to know that a board can only pass bylaws that are under specific categories of the Condominium Act and the regulations. Most bylaws that a condominium corporation can pass are listed in Section 56 of the Act and in Section 14 of the regulations. Please take a look at these sections and read through the different types of bylaws that are permitted, and ensure you consult your lawyer. The Condominium Act also states that bylaws must be reasonable and consistent with both the Act and the Condo Corporation's declaration. That means that the bylaws cannot conflict with either of the two. So how does a board go about passing a bylaw? First, it is common and strongly recommended to use the corporation's lawyer to draft the bylaw. Having a lawyer prepare the bylaw ensures that there is alignment between the bylaw and either the corporation's declaration or Condominium Act. For example, using bylaws taken from other condo corporations may not work for your condo corporation, as declarations will differ. Second, the condo's board of directors must review the bylaw draft. If the board would like to make any further changes to the draft bylaw, then they can bring those changes to the lawyer's attention. Once they are satisfied with the bylaw, they approve it by board resolution at a board meeting. The third and most difficult step is owner approval. The board can seek approval from the owners at the AGM or at a special meeting called specifically for the purpose of passing the bylaw. If a vote is to be held at the AGM, the agenda for the meeting must clearly indicate that the bylaw is to be approved. Voting can be complicated, so make sure you are educated. It is advisable to have your lawyer attend the meeting. The bylaw, in legal terms, must be ratified. To ratify a bylaw means that the owners of the condominium corporation approve the bylaw by a vote. Now, assuming the owners approve the bylaw, the last step involves two requirements. The first requirement is the filling of the prescribed form, which states that the board has complied with all Condominium Act requirements. The second is the registration of the bylaw against title of all types of units that make up the condominium corporation. It is important to note that a bylaw does not come into effect until this last step is fulfilled. Bylaws are typically registered by the condominium corporation's lawyer. At a meeting of owners to approve a bylaw, unit owners are also able to propose any bylaw changes. However, any changes made may not significantly alter the original intent of the bylaw. For example, a bylaw increasing the number of directors on the board cannot be changed to instead decrease the number of directors on the board. This would be considered a substantial change, and the condominium corporation would likely be required to give notice of the amended bylaw and call a new meeting to vote on its approval. If substantial changes are required, the approval process starts over again. It's best to check with legal counsel on what is a substantial change. Depending on the bylaw that the board wants to pass, there are different voting thresholds that apply. For the bylaws listed in Section 56 of the Act, the owners of a majority of the units in the corporation vote in favor of the bylaw with or without amendments. That means over 50% of all units, not just those present at the meeting. For the bylaws in Section 14 of the regulations, the bylaws threshold is reduced to just a majority of unit owners present or represented by proxy at a duly constituted meeting of owners. A proxy is a person who is appointed in writing to act on behalf of a unit owner at a meeting of owners. A proxy form, which must be completed and signed by a unit owner, gives the proxy authority to vote on matters that may come before a meeting of owners, and also counts for quorum. The authority given to the proxy is subject to the unit owner's specific instructions. A proxy does not need to be a unit owner. Examples under Section 14 include bylaws relating to record keeping, retention period for records, electronic voting, and methods of voting, as well as extending disclosure requirements for directors. Passing a bylaw is not an easy task by any means. Prior to passing a bylaw, the board should communicate properly with owners to ensure that the bylaw is one that they will support. For example, if a board receives recurring comments from the owners that they would like to see the implementation of electronic voting, then the board knows that an electronic voting bylaw could be well supported. It always helps to explain to owners the purpose of the bylaw and why it might help the condominium corporation operate better. For example, few owners know how a standard unit bylaw works, but by explaining what the purpose of the bylaw is and answering any questions, the owners will be able to see how that bylaw could help them and feel encouraged to vote for the bylaw. Prior to holding the vote, the board may also wish to evaluate whether or not the bylaw will be successful. If it is clear that the owners will not support the bylaw, then the board could consider whether the meeting should be adjourned or go forward in light of the costs and consequences of a failed vote. If a meeting obtains quorum and yet too few owners are represented to approve the bylaw, then there may be some options. Quorum is the minimum number of eligible voters required to be present in order for a condominium corporation to conduct business at a meeting of owners. Adjourning the meeting is one option that allows the board to collect more proxies voting in favor of the bylaw prior to moving on to the second phase. This process can create complicated scenarios, so it is best to look for advice from your lawyer. It is important to be aware that ballots cannot be transferred to an adjourned meeting, but proxies can. That is why you must collect proxies from the owners in attendance at the first meeting. Now let's look at a few examples. For example 1, we'll use a standard unit bylaw. As this falls under Section 56, it must be approved by a majority of units in the condominium corporation. Let's assume here that the condominium corporation has 100 voting units. 10 people attend in person, and 17 are represented by proxy. That gives a total of 27 at the meeting. Although quorum is met, it is not possible for the corporation to obtain a majority of all units in the corporation at that particular meeting. The board may propose via motion an adjournment. However, if the motion fails, then the vote will proceed and obviously fail. The value of the adjournment is that more proxies voting in favor of the bylaw can be collected for the adjourned meeting. Let's look at a second example. A board wants to pass a bylaw about candidate disclosure requirements. This is a bylaw under Section 14, so only a majority of those present at the meeting need to approve it. For this example, we will assume again that we have 100 voting units. 16 people are in attendance at the meeting, 10 by proxy, for a total of 26. All 10 proxies are in favor of the bylaw, and the owners generally support the bylaw. In order to have a majority of those present, you need 4 votes, so the vote can proceed. For the third example, let's assume that we are creating a bylaw for a director's code of ethics. As this will fall under Section 56 of the Act, a majority of units in the corporation must approve it. Again, let's assume we have 100 voting units. 60 unit owners attend the meeting. No proxies are submitted. The support for the bylaw is unknown. As a board, what approach should you take? The board has 2 options. Either take the vote and see if the same will pass with 51 owners, or adjourn the vote to a date and time set within a reasonable time frame to hold the vote. This must be done by motion, which may be defeated by the majority of the owners in the room, and the vote would have to proceed. Keep in mind, there are judgment calls that must be made by the board in every bylaw voting situation. As long as a board understands the concepts relating to bylaws and the various tips that can be utilized, then the board will be in a good position to make the important decisions needed to get their bylaws passed. As always, though, it is important to know how the Act works and what the options are based on the parameters in the Act. Thanks for listening. For additional learning opportunities, including links to our videos and podcasts, visit CCI Toronto's website at ccitoronto.org.